Thank you, Vitaly. I do like him really, despite the horrible way I treat him. So, okay, Vitaly's already introduced you to me. Really, if you don't know, I've been working in digital for 23 years. I work with a huge range of different organizations, from commercial organizations like Puma to charities like Doctors Without Borders or governments like the European Commission. Written lots of books, 2 books at the moment with Smashing Magazine, and another book to come, which I'm really excited about and really enjoying, but more on that later. So enough about me. Let's talk about our subject today, which is customer journey mapping. And really the kind of aim that I have with this subject is to bring marketers and user experience people together, because let's be honest, we don't tend to get on particularly well. Marketers see us as constantly worrying about the user experience, that we want to be, you know, put the user first all the time, and we don't live in the real business reality and all of that kind of stuff. While we see marketers as, you know, quite happy to ruin the experience if it can win a short-term buck. We see them as quite short-termist in some ways. And actually, we're both wrong, right? Actually, we're both coming at the same problem from different angles. And I actually think that there is a tool out there that can help us bring our different perspectives together, and that is customer journey mapping. Customer journey mapping has become hugely popular in recent years, and with good reason. And what I want to present to you today really is some practical advice about how to go about mapping the customer journey, what to do with your customer journey once you've mapped it. But before we get into that, I want to start with the basics, and that is, how do we convince our colleagues in marketing, our product owners and other people that they need to map the customer journey, to make the effort to do it in the first place? And the way I start is by looking back. As I said, I've been working in digital for 23 years, but I'm very much from the pre-digital era. If you know, if I'm honest, I'm of that age where I can remember the world back then, and it was a much simpler place for marketers and business entrepreneurs, because life used to be so simple. If you wanted to reach your customers, you would you know, either look at print, broadcast, direct mail, or telemarketing. You had a very small pool of different tools with which to work. While by contrast, today we have so many more. We've got social, we've got mobile, we've got pay-per-click, we've got search engines, we've got email, we've got websites, we've got blogs that we run ourselves, we've got blogs that blogger engagement programs, and then there's new stuff coming on like chatbots and AI, and oh, it's endless, right? There are so many ways that we can interact with our consumers, and you know, those are just the top level sections. If you take something like social, that in itself is a nightmare. You know, you've got LinkedIn, Facebook, Snapchat, you've got Instagram, you've got WhatsApp, Twitter, Bebop isn't even a real thing, but who knows these days? There's so many of these things, so many channels, and yet, you know, businesses can only invest so much in their sales and marketing. So how do you know who to reach and where to reach them? Because you start investing in one of these channels, right? But is that channel going to still be around? Look at Vine. Do you remember Vine? You think about all those companies that invested ages building up their Vine profile or MySpace profile, right? Only for them to disappear. The truth is, we have a limited resource, right? And a near limitless potential channels through which to reach people. Where do we put our energies? And that is why I think something like customer journey mapping can be so invaluable to our colleagues in other parts of the organization, because it will help us ascertain which channels matter the most, and more particularly, when to use those channels, because not all channels are applicable at all parts in the sales journey, the sales funnel, which is the terminology that your marketing colleagues will no doubt use. And I think one of the good starting places to have this conversation about customer journey mapping is talking about engagement, right? And talking about the idea of a sales funnel, because this is something that marketers are very familiar with, right? The idea that you progressively move a potential customer down a sales funnel to a point of conversion. But in actual fact, they often think of it in the wrong way, because they think about moving down a sales funnel to a point of final conversion. But actually, that isn't how it works. In reality, it's a series of micro conversion points as you go down the funnel, right? Or as you, in the UX parlance, you go on your journey, right? So think of it this way. Let's take a charity as an example, right? A charity, your engagement with a charity might begin because you saw a friend's social media update, right? They posted about a crisis that a particular charity has promoted. Perhaps they retweeted, right, a post that your charity has put out into the world, right? Well, for a start, there's your first point of engagement right there, that they've retweeted, they've reshared something that you've done. So they've taken an action, right? They've taken an action, which is to retweet. Then a consumer, a user clicks on that link in that social media update. That again is another action, another step, another part of engagement. And they read a blog post about the title. And maybe that compels them enough to sign up for a newsletter, or to reshare the content themselves, or take some other form of action, right? Notice how each action is taking a little bit more commitment than the one before. So they've signed up for a newsletter, and then they get a reminder, an email from the charity reminding them about the crisis and encouraging them to go back to the website and find out more. So there's another action again. Then they might be asked to make a donation to that particular crisis. Again, that's a bigger action, another step, more engagement. And then from there, they might be encouraged to make a monthly donation. And from there to fundraise. And eventually, maybe even to give a legacy when they die. You see how it's a journey, okay? It's building one on top of another, one action after another after another. But the problem is it only takes one part of the journey to fall down, for something to go wrong, and it actually kills the journey dead, right? That sales funnel falls apart when there's a weak link to it. It's like, for example, the website was hard to use, or took too long to load, or whatever else. So all of the parts of our journey need to work together. You can begin to see how customer journey mapping can help. Let me give you another way of looking at it as well. Right. So the customer's going on a journey, okay? And there are different components of this sales funnel that they go through. So at the top of the sales funnel, there'll be a variety of different methods of grabbing someone's initial attention. So pay-per-click, social, email campaign, whatever, right? And then that drives them through to a website that converts, okay? Now, depending on where people have come into the sales funnel, you'll find that there are different levels of conversion. Okay. So for example, in the graphic that you're seeing on the screen now, you've got pay-per-click has got a much lower conversion rate than, say, email, for example. Okay. So together, okay, the conversion rate for the website is 20%. Now, if you're not thinking in terms of a journey, but rather seeing these as independent things, you've got your media campaign that's driving traffic, and then you've got your website that's converting. If you're looking at those bits in isolation, you could end up being very disappointed with the website, but over the moon with your pay-per-click. And the reason being is because the pay-per-click might generate a lot of traffic, but it's just not converting very well. While the website, when you look at the website, you might conclude, actually, the website is underperforming. We expect a conversion rate higher than 20%, okay? But if you just remove the pay-per-click, your conversion rate on your website goes up. Now, the reason that I'm showing you that somewhat convoluted little bit of maths is to demonstrate that another benefit of thinking and talking about customer journey mapping with our colleagues is because it enables us to look holistically at the journey and identify weak points that we might not otherwise see and that often get overlooked, such as the pay-per-click was underperforming. You won't necessarily get that if you're looking at each part in isolation. I could give you a real world example of where things can go terribly wrong if you're not looking holistically at the journey as a whole. There's a charity in the UK called RSPB, Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, right? They had a tried and tested sales funnel that they used all of the time. And the sales funnels started with the TV advertising campaign and then drove people to a website. And they've been doing this same model for years and years. In fact, so long that they were doing it before the web was a thing. It used to be that their TV advertising drove people to a telephone number. People would give a donation. And when they thought, they had this wonderful idea of, we're going to do a cost saving measure, right? And we're not going to do the expensive phone lines anymore. We're going to drive people to a website. But because a different team dealt with the website that dealt with the TV advertising, right? It was never looked at as to what kind of conversion rate you were getting. Now you were driving to the website rather than the phone line. And actually their conversion rate on their website was a shockingly low 0.32%. So they were driving all this traffic to the website and the website was underperforming. But nobody was looking holistically at the journey as a whole. Now, we did that. We stepped back and we said, well, look, okay, let's just park TV advertising for one cycle, right? And instead, let's look at investing a fraction of that money into the website. And we will look to increase the conversion rate to the website to about 1.5%. We felt that was a reasonable figure. And that would generate an extra £2,840,000 worth of donations by improving the website. And that 2,840,000 would be every cycle, every time they ran a TV advertising campaign after that. Okay. Wow. No brainer, isn't it? And in actual fact, we worked out that if they didn't change the website and they wanted to generate an extra nearly 3 million in donations with their existing website, their TV advertising would have to drive an extra 31 million people to the website to generate that same 3 million. It's a no brainer, isn't it? They didn't do it. Now, the reason they didn't do it was because they weren't looking holistically. They weren't considering the journey. They were looking at each bit in isolation. There was a team that was responsible for the website and they had their budget. And there was a team responsible for the marketing and they had their budget. And there was no way the marketing team was going to hand across some of their budget to the digital team to improve the website, because that wasn't their problem. That wasn't their business. We need to look holistically, and that is where customer journey mapping comes in. So hopefully I've given you a kind of a sense of why customer journey mapping is so important and how you go about presenting that to colleagues within your organization. Notice that I didn't talk about creating an outstanding customer experience at any point in that. I talked about the business benefits of looking holistically, right? The way that you can improve conversion, the way that you can identify problems in the journey, etc. But we want to create a customer journey map. Now we need to, well, know a little bit about our customers. You can't create a customer journey map without knowing more about who our customers are. And there are specific things that we need to know, things that organizations aren't always particularly good at gathering. For example, we need to know who our audience is. We need to know who influences them, what those people want to, what the audience wants to know in order to make a purchase, and what resonates with them. But we also need to know about the journey itself. What channels do they use? What steps do they complete on that journey? And what barriers do they face? So how do we get to know these kinds of things? Now, this isn't a talk that's going to dive in to the in-depths of user experience. I don't want to teach you guys how to suck eggs. A lot of you, I'm sure, are already experts in this kind of area, but there are just a few things that I want to touch on. First of all, there needs to be some kind of prioritization of audiences. I'm amazed at how many organizations refuse to prioritize their audiences, right? Refuse to say, look, this group of people are more valuable to our business than this group of people. But in truth, if you're going to be mapping the customer journey, you need to be mapping a specific customer journey, right? Yeah, the more generic your user journey is that you're trying to map, the harder it's going to be, the less accurate it's going to be, and the less useful it's going to be to the audience. So therefore, you need to map a more specific journey. Now, mapping a specific journey means that you need to decide what journeys you're going to map, because you're not going to be able to map every single audience you've got. I doubt you're going to get the time or resources to do that. At least, well, perhaps I'm not good enough at selling customer journey mapping. I don't know, but I haven't been able to. So what you do is you prioritize your audiences, and you then map the most important of your audiences, right? So who are the audiences that you're looking to map, and which ones matter most to the organization? The reason we're doing this is because we need to design the customer journey for somebody while alienating nobody. If you make it generic, it will not be as effective. It's as simple as that. So once we've decided who the primary audiences are that we want to map and understand better, what do we need to gather on these people? Well, we need to understand what their goals are, right? What they're trying to ultimately achieve. We also need to have a good idea of their circumstances, what's driving them to complete this goal, what barriers exist in their life that are preventing them from reaching that goal, right? What factors are involved in that decision making. We need to know their concerns, their pain points. What are they struggling with, right? What are they hoping that our products or services will help them overcome? And what's influencing them in that journey and in that decision making? Now, the trouble is that we often go in and say, well, we need to do a load of user research, right, before we can map the customer journey. And it's going to involve, you know, interviewing people that are exactly the right demographics across the globe and blah, 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 blah. And it's going to cost X thousand. We're going to need to get a user experience agency in to help us with it. And all of these things, we make it so big that nobody's going to approve it. Nobody's going to make it happen. So I'm not saying that those things aren't necessary. I'm saying that to make it more accessible, to make it more likely that you start to do this process, start easy, start simple. Start by consolidating existing research. Most organizations already have some user research on their customers, personas that have been produced and then put in a drawer somewhere, testimonials that have been written, logs about, you know, customer complaints or questions, all of that kind of stuff. Gather the data together from across the organizations into a central place, right? You know, whether that be key findings from analytics, session recorder sessions, whatever, bring it all together. And then do some talking to users, right? To fill in the gaps. Rather than starting from a blank slate, start with what you already know before you start going and getting some new stuff. And then once you've done all of that, then we can start visualizing that in the form of a customer journey map. So let's look a little bit more detail at those things. First of all, consolidate what you know. So there are lots of sources that are available to us within an organization to better understand our customers, right? So the first one is your social media, right? Go to the people that are dealing with social media every day, right? I know huge amounts about my customers just by looking at who follows me on Twitter, who follows me on LinkedIn, who follows me on Facebook. What do those people do? What do they write about? What do they talk about? What questions do they ask, right? These are things you used to have to pay millions of pounds in market research fees to find out. And now people lay out their entire lives for free online. So dive into people's social media followings and understand a little bit about your audience and what drives them, what motivates them. The other thing is, like I said, look at existing research that's been done before. Yeah, sure, it might be slightly out of date, but there will be nuggets in there that's still relevant and still interesting. Because one objection that you will hear when you suggest customer journey maps are things like, well, we've done personas before, right? Great, let's have a look at them. Let's understand them. Let's see what they contain and what they don't contain. Rather than dismissing those things as they're no good, at least get hold of them and look at them. Also, talk to customer-facing staff. So I'm talking about salespeople, customer support people. These are the people that are dealing and interacting with customers on a daily basis, and they will know an unprecedented amount about their customers, particularly their pain points, their goals, their questions, their objections, their concerns, those kinds of things. And then finally, we can look at our analytics, our session recorders, our A/B testing, our search. What are people searching on that's bringing them to your website in the first place? When they arrive on your website, what search terms do they enter into your website, right? What pages do people spend the most time looking at on your site? What pages do they scroll through the most and pay most attention to? All of these will give you indications and insights into who they are. All of that can be done without spending a penny. That said, in fact, there are a plethora of different tools that are available to us that take nothing more than a little bit of effort on our part rather than spending big budgets, right? And one of my favorites actually is something called top task analysis. And I don't know whether you've come across top task analysis before, but it's actually a technique created by a guy called Jerry McGovern. And basically what it's doing is trying to identify the biggest concerns, the biggest questions, the biggest tasks that users are wanting to complete. And this is invaluable information when mapping a customer journey. And I'm not going to spend too much time getting into it now, but essentially it's a survey. And it's a survey that asks people to rank different things that might be of interest to them from 1 to 5. Okay, there's a great list apart article on top task analysis. So if you search on top task analysis, a list apart, you'll find it. What's particularly interesting about top task analysis is it will reveal that actually the vast majority of people are only interested in a small number of tasks, right? They don't have this, there are so many things we could talk about. There's so many things that a user might be wanting to do or want answers to, that when you're creating something like a customer journey map, you just can't include all those things, right? You can't include everything. You have to tell a story in that. We'll come on to that more in later. So a top task analysis will help you identify what those key things are. Also, just running something like a very simple survey often can be incredibly powerful. So I've got a video masterclass that I created on encouraging users to complete compelling calls to action, or create compelling calls to action. And I was trying to work out what was it about this masterclass? How could I increase conversion on this masterclass? How could I encourage more people to enroll and to sign up? So I ran a 1-question survey on exit. As people went to exit, I said to them, if you decide not to enroll today, it'd be useful to know why. And I listed a load of possible reasons why somebody might not enroll. Just that was 1 question. That was all I asked. But actually, that was incredibly useful in helping me to understand the journey that people were on, the objections that they had, the issues that they had. But ultimately, nothing beats spending time with actual users and talking to them. And I know I've been emphasizing about trying to save time and money, but I think you'll find that as you gather all this data together, there will be some holes in your knowledge that you'll need to fill in by talking to users. And when I talk about this to marketing colleagues in organizations, I encourage them to do it personally rather than just getting an agency to do it. To actually spend time. It's amazing how many marketers have not spent time with their own customers, the very people they're trying to sell with. So I always try and encourage them to do that, and not only to do it personally, but to do it regularly. So I don't know whether you've ever read Rocket Surgery Made Easy, the follow-up book to Don't Make Me Think by Steve Krug. And in that book, he recommends that you just meet with 3 people once a month. Right. And actually, that's a really good, simple, achievable thing that any organization could do. So, yeah, there are lots of things you could do when you meet up with users. You can obviously do interviews. You can do things like in-field studies with people. You can run usability testing. You can even do focus groups. It's more about having that regular contact. It's very hard to map a journey or create a realistic persona or anything like that if you're not actually meeting with people on a regular basis, if you're not getting to know them personally. Okay, so we've done a load of user research. Now we've got to visualize it. Well, we've got a lot of different tools for visualizing. But before we get into that, how do you convince people that that's even worth doing to visualize the user experience? Well, I used 4 arguments. First argument I use is that actually having a visualization like this helps focus us on users. It's very easy when you're in the middle of a project, when deadlines are pushing, when the pressure's on, to forget the user, right? But if we want to reach the user, if we want to encourage conversion, if we want to encourage them to take action, we need to keep them front and center in our minds. And a visualization will help us do that, whether it be a persona or a customer journey map or whatever. It will help us remember. There's an urban legend flying around. I've no idea whether it's true or not, but that in Amazon, they leave an empty seat at every meeting. And the idea is that seat represents the customer. That it reminds people not to forget the customer in the midst of discussions. And a visualization can do the same thing. The other reason that I give to people for visualizing the user is that it creates a common understanding, right? You've got all these different people involved in trying to increase conversion or create a more effective experience or whatever it is you're trying to do. And having a common vision of who you're trying to reach is crucial to make sure that your design, your copy, everything else is heading in the same direction. Something like a customer journey map is also really useful for allowing us to see the big picture, how a project that we might be working on fits within the broader journey. It gives context for a project. And I'll actually explore that in a little bit more later on. And then it's also customer journey mapping is a great way of highlighting weaknesses and opportunities within the journey to increase conversion, to increase the effectiveness of your various channels that you're using. Why not just use personas for this, you might argue, or your marketing colleagues might argue. Well, personas are great. They absolutely have their place, and they're an invaluable marketing tool. All right. They help marketers understand their customers better and begin to picture them and associate with them. And it's very good. They're very useful tools when you're trying to create design and copy that resonates emotionally with people, right? Because you need to understand that they've got 2 kids, that they've got a busy, pressured job, that they read The Guardian and drive an Audi. All those things are useful. But when it comes to customer journey mapping and conversion optimization, actually the traditional persona has got the wrong emphasis, right? It's emphasizing who the person is rather than what they want to do and what questions they have about doing it. So there are other options available to you. One that I use quite a lot is a version of empathy mapping. I've adapted my empathy maps a little bit to suit my needs, but basically the focus is different to a persona, right? It focuses on tasks, questions, feelings, influences, pain points, and overall goals, right? So I'm much more interested in what a user wants to do and the barriers that they might be encountering to do that rather than who they are. Do you see the difference? But to be honest, personas and empathy maps do both have their shortcomings. Right? Yes, you can turn them into great visuals, right? Yes, they can still help focus you on the user, remind you about who the user is and all of those kinds of things. But they're a snapshot in time. They don't show the journey. They don't, how we feel, the questions we have, the tasks we want to complete, all of those kinds of things change over time. And that is why customer journey mapping has actually more value, because it shows that progression that happens. Now, there are other tools available to us. We've got things like user story cards as well. But customer journey mapping gives us that big picture. Well, user story cards and things like that are much better for very specific projects in very specific circumstances. So how do we go about creating a customer journey map, right? I've really now spent half the presentation selling customer journey maps, but it's so important to do, right? The actual creating them is relatively straightforward, if I'm honest with you. There is no magic formula to it. First step, right? You need to assemble the right people. Ideally, you'd love to have a room full of users, right? Or certainly to have users involved alongside internal stakeholders. However, I am not naive. I am a pragmatist. I've been working in this industry for a long time, and I know that getting users into a room together to work on something like this is difficult. So If you can't do that, I still think it is worth doing customer journey mapping, right? Instead of having customers in the room, you have those people that intimately know customers, those customer support people, those sales people, people that are spending time with the customer every day. You can always validate your customer journey map with customers afterwards, as I come on to later. You also want people in the room that have data on the customer, marketers, you know, people with the analytics, anybody like that. You want them in the room as well. And then in my experience, it also helps to have a senior stakeholder in the room. To be honest with you, senior stakeholders know bugger all about the customer, right? The more senior you are in most organizations, the less contact you have with the people you're actually selling to. But we want them in the room because if they're involved in the process, then they feel more ownership over the customer journey map, which means the customer journey map will be promoted and used more. They will become an advocate for the customer journey map if they're involved in the creation of it, right? It's much harder to get people to advocate for something if they've not been involved in creating that thing. So having at least one senior stakeholder in the room never hurts as well. So once you've got all these people in the room, you need to run a workshop. And that workshop, in my experience, you can map a kind of preliminary customer journey in a couple of hours for a single customer. Ideally, you do a 6-hour workshop. I normally do a customer journey map in the morning, of mapping the current customer journey. And then in the afternoon, I like to do an aspirational customer journey map where we look to the future. What would our perfect customer journey be? How could it be better? So ideally, I like to do a kind of whole day workshop, but you can map a journey in a couple of hours if you need to. And the first step in doing that is to decide on the steps in your journey, right? Now, I've been doing this a long time with a lot of different organizations. And the best tip I can give here is to aim for approximately 5 steps in your journey, right? The reason being is that, well, it's twofold. One is if you have a lot more steps than that, it's going to take you too long to create that journey, right? Because you're going to have to look and address each one of those steps. And it's going to take a long time to go through that and work it all out and understand it. And so suddenly your 2 hours becomes 4 hours, right? And that's problematic. So I tend to find that about 5 steps works well. Also, the other reason for going for 5 steps is the infographic that comes out at the end of this, the visualization of your customer journey map. The more steps you have, the more complicated it becomes, right? The more complicated it becomes, then the more people are going to be confused by it, right? If people are confused by it, then they won't use it. And the whole thing was a waste of time. So my experience, at least, perhaps other people have managed to achieve things I can't, but 5 steps is pretty good. So this now raises the question, well, hang on a minute. There are a lot more than 5 steps in my journey. Well, it all depends on how much detail you go into, right? One option is that you do your entire journey. So let's go back to our charity example, from initially encountering a charity to when you die and leave a legacy. You could do that entire journey, right? In which case, if you're going to do it in 5 steps, those are going to need to be big steps, right? And so your customer journey is going to be quite superficial, right? The other option is actually just look at a part of the journey, okay? So maybe you map up to people making their first donation, okay? And again, you could have 5 steps for that part of the journey. So the scope of what you map is entirely down to the context and the use for your customer journey map, right? If you're using your customer journey map to set overall strategy and as a kind of way of unifying all the different things that are going on across the organization, then you want a very high level customer journey map that kind of encompasses the whole thing, right? If, however, you're creating a customer journey map for a particular project that's happening, then you could just map the parts of the journey that the project addresses, and maybe a step before and a step after to give context to the project you're in. All right. So there are different levels of customer journey mapping that you can do. And so you need to know what level you're looking for, what role that customer journey map is going to play going in so that you can decide on what your steps are. So for example, for a typical e-commerce site, your steps might be recognizing a need. It might be researching the options that are available to you, making a purchase, getting the item delivered, and then after sales support. That could be a typical number of steps in your journey, right? Then once you've decided that, then you've got to decide on what you want to track on your journey, right? So for each of those steps, what do you want to know? All right. So typically I look at what questions people have for each step, what tasks they're trying to complete, how they're feeling during that step, what their influences are, what's influencing their behavior, and what touch points are they using, what channels, what points of interaction are they using with an organization. So what you end up with is a grid that looks like this, with your steps running horizontally across, as columns, all right? And then down the side as rows, you've got what you want to know about each step. Now, you notice I've added an additional one on the bottom there, which is weaknesses. So as you're going through the workshop, and I'll explain how to do that in just a second, people will come up with, will say things like, oh, we're not very good at doing that. Right. So have a row where you keep a note of your weaknesses and your problems, and you'll see why that's really worthwhile doing in a minute. So once you've got this, usually I do it as a massive, I get rolls of paper that I put across the wall, and I draw up this grid on the wall. And then essentially what you're doing is you're going through each cell in the grid to unpack what's there. So essentially you're generating ideas. So for example, if we're in the research, we're researching what product we're going to buy, what tasks are we trying to complete, what questions do we have? And we generate loads of ideas about that, right? And I usually put them on Post-it notes, as is the way of UX designers everywhere, and stick them in the relevant cell on the wall. Now, the reason we put them on Post-it notes is because often later on, when you're looking back at all of this, you start going, well, really, that question isn't asked there. It's asked later in the process, and you end up wanting to move things around. So having them on Post-it notes is really worthwhile. Top tip, you can get extra sticky Post-it notes these days. Do it, right? Otherwise, you'll end up with Post-it notes all over the floor, and it's a nightmare. Now, you're going to generate far more ideas than you could put in the final infographic. Right. So what I tend to do is a dot voting exercise at the end. Right. So once you've gone through and you've filled everything in, I then go back through everything and I give people 3 votes for each of the cells in that customer journey map. Right. So for each cell, they can vote either for their top 3 questions or tasks or whatever it is in that cell, or they could spend all 3 votes on one or spread them out as they want to. All right. So that way you begin to narrow down what's really important. Your top task analysis would help with this as well. So you can actually base it on real data rather than assumptions. Okay. This is also something you might want to validate with users afterwards, obviously. And then it's really a rinse and repeat. You go through each cell one after another like this. Now, if you're going to do that all as one big group, then you're not going to get it done in 2 hours. So what I normally do is do one column, one step in our journey as a group, so people get the hang of it. Then I split people down into smaller groups, and I get them to do 1 step each. Okay, so if you've got 5 steps, you do 1 as a group, and then split everybody down into 4 smaller groups to do the remaining steps. But the voting part happens back together as a group at the end. And the reason I do that is so everybody can see everybody else's work, right? And so if they can think of something that one of the other groups has missed, they can pop it in and add it in later. So it really is a just kind of work through cell by cell, column by column, okay? Then at the end, once all of that has been done, you can then validate that with real users if you're not doing it with real users at the time, where you can basically just put it in front of people and say, does this represent your journey? Okay, and what you end up with is something like this, right? This is a customer journey map I did for a UK charity called the Samaritans. And the Samaritans are basically a mental health organization. So if you have something go wrong in your life, then you call the Samaritans. Now, obviously, therefore, the customer journey map is very focused around how people are feeling. So what you can see here is our columns running across the top here, where someone has a life event. Maybe someone dies in the family, they lose their job, they get ill, whatever it is. They have a realization that they're not coping with the problem that they're facing. They start seeking help, maybe go to their local doctor or friends or family or people like that. Eventually, they contact the Samaritans, where they then receive help, and then they have their life afterwards. And then for each of those steps, you can see how we've got how people are feeling, what questions that they're having during that phase, what they're doing, what actions they're taking. And then we looked at weaknesses. Now, what was particularly interesting about this is that it revealed some interesting facts. What we were able to identify as we were going through this, that things started going wrong when people contacted the Samaritans, that they were great on the phone, but they were pretty slow via messaging, text messaging and email, okay? And the volunteers hated dealing with all these different systems, and they just wanted to do the phone. And then they didn't support anything else at all. They didn't support the web. They didn't support WhatsApp or instant messaging or anything like that. So we identified a real weakness that we then, in the afternoon, when we created a aspirational customer journey map, we recognized the weakness, and we then went on and created, well, what could be the solution for that? And the solution that we came up with was a single volunteering system that was basically used APIs to plug in all of these different platforms. So the volunteers only had to deal with one platform, right? So we used customer journey mapping as a starting block to imagine the possibilities, imagine the futures. And that's where we come on to how to use these customer journey maps when you produce them. And they can be invaluable, as you can see from the Samaritans example. They were spending all their money doing marketing and advertising and promotion when they should have been investing in the experience itself. So actually doing the customer journey mapping helped them identify a project that they needed to do, which was improve the experience for the volunteers and for people actually calling. It also helped to prioritize that project over things like marketing, which they'd been doing traditionally, because actually awareness of the Samaritans is really high in the UK. So that wasn't as big an issue. And it even went as far as helping define some of the features in that product. So customer journey mapping can be invaluable for shaping the direction of the projects that you undertake as an organization. But it's also, as I said, it's about keeping the user front and center in people's minds. And I've used it in all kinds of ways to do that. I've used it in meetings, so made sure that we've always got a customer journey map in front of us when we have meetings. I've even changed people's screensavers to be customer journey maps. So every time their screensaver kicks in, they see the customer. I've made them turn them into art that I've put on the wall. You think about your office. In most offices around the world, what's on your walls? It's pictures of your executive, your products, your buildings, awards you've won, all internal looking stuff, right? Wouldn't it be so much better if your walls were covered with your customers to keep you focused on your customers? Hell, you might even want to turn them into mouse mats, which is something else I've done in the past. You want to have the customer constantly in your face, and a customer journey mapping visual will really help you to do that. So just a couple of little words as we wrap up about actually making the infographic, the visual itself. For a start, keep it simple. Don't try to include too much information. The truth is that with the customer journey, it's actually incredibly complicated. Users go back on themselves. They repeat themselves. There's often branches of users going in different direction. There are hundreds of questions they might be asking at any particular stage. You can't include all of that information. If you do, the customer journey map becomes unreadable. I mean, this is probably the most famous customer journey map that was ever produced. And this was produced, I think, by Adaptive Path years and years back. And it became the kind of archetypal customer journey map, the kind of, that showcased it. But in truth, it's probably way too complicated, right? To be referred to regularly, okay? And actually a much simpler customer journey map is often a lot more compelling. So just bear that in mind. The other thing is your customer journey map is not going to be accurate, right? It's not going to be 100% accurate. You're telling a story, right? You're telling a story of an archetypal customer going on an archetypal journey, right? It's not trying to be 100% representative. And it's really important to remember that when you do the visualization. Otherwise, once again, it becomes too complicated. So this is, I think, quite a nice example, right? So here's a journey that, you know, is really quite understandable. It's quite simple. You know, you can take it in at a glance. Much, much more effective than that previous example, which had far too much going on. And I would recommend, if you're not a particularly designer person, if you're more of a UX person or a marketer, then get a designer to do this. This is what designers excel at, organizing information in an easy to digest way. So don't try and do it yourself. I've seen that happen before, and it rarely turns out well. And that's really all I wanted to say for this particular presentation. I've got a complete article on this subject where I break it all down in a lot more detail. Well, not a lot more detail, but you can read it at boag.world/CJM. There's a load of promotional crap as well, because, you know, I like to sell stuff, but Vitaly's come back onto the video, and so he'll probably tell me off for promoting my London workshop, which is excellent value, by the way, and coming up very soon. You should attend it. Hello, Vitaly.
Hello, Paul. Thank you so much for the presentation and for your blatant advertising right here. So I think at this point you can turn off your screen, remove
well,
screen
if I
sharing.
turn off the screen, they won't be able to see my blatant advertising,
Correct.
will they?
That's
All right,
correct.
hang on.
Just
In a while. Do a screen capture, everybody. Make sure you do. Right, how do I stop sharing? Click that button.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much, Paul. That was very insightful. That's very interesting. And as I was listening, I had a couple of questions, of course, and we have a few more coming in the chat. If you have a question, dear friends watching this now, please paste them in, because please type them in the questions Q&A area, and then I will bring them up as well. The same goes for YouTube too. Paul, I have a question before we start there, though. So you actually mentioned in the beginning that it's very common that you have a wonderful war happening between UX department and marketing department.
Yeah.
So if you find yourself in a company where you can almost sense that there is a tension, maybe it's not a war, but there is some tension between marketing people and UX people, where would you even start there to resolve the conflict? Because it might be going quite deep, especially the larger the organization is, right?
Sure, yeah. I mean, a lot of it comes down to people and relationships. So it's hard to give a generic answer to something like that, because it's often so specific to the people involved. But there are a few things that I normally start with. First of all, is I speak the language of marketing, right? So I never talk about user experience, right? Marketers don't care about user experience. In fact, most people don't care about user experience except user experience specialists, right? But what they do care about is what creating a great and outstanding user experience can provide. I think it was Jared Spool that wrote a brilliant article about why I can't convince an executive of anything and neither can you, right? Brilliant article title. And in it, he basically said, you find out what they already care about and you show how creating a great user experience can deliver that. So that's exactly what you want to start doing with your marketers. You want to find out what they already care about, and they care about meeting their targets. A lot of marketing teams have quite aggressive targets given to them by senior management, and they need to meet those targets. So that is the language you need to speak. So second thing I do is break down those departmental barriers. So get up off your ass, go and spend time with these people, not having meetings with them, but spend time with them. So, you know, take them out for coffee, take them out for lunch, ask whether you can just sit and watch, you know, see what they do for a day. Can you go and sit next to them in offices? You know, break down those barriers in any way you can. And show a sincere interest in them and their problems and their issues rather than the agenda you want to push. We're so busy pushing our own agenda that we don't actually, meet people's needs.
So kind of then applying the principles of design towards our own companies then, because very often we tend to apply it to products, right?
I was just about to say that and you beat me to it. Yeah, it's taking all the things that we're so good at with our users, but we're terrible at doing with our colleagues. You know, we don't bother to understand their pain points, their goals, their questions, their concerns. We don't do any of that stuff with our colleagues, you know, and that's stupid. That just sucks.
That's something that we can change. So yeah. Vivian has been waiting for an answer to a question for 24 minutes, so I don't want her to wait more.
Okay.
Vivian is wondering how to do customer journey map remotely. Is there any software that you would recommend?
Oh, this is a pain in the arse, I'll be honest. Because it happens that my article on customer journey mapping comes up number one on Google for customer journey mapping. And so I get a lot of inquiries from people going, yeah, well, can you help us with a customer journey map? And they're in, I don't know, Venezuela or somewhere and don't have the budget for me to go over to do it. And I've been agonizing about a way to do it remotely for ages because, you know, I don't want to turn away business. And I haven't been able to come up with one, if I'm honest. It's very much something you want to do in a room with people. Which is probably not the answer that you really want, but because it is as much about getting buy-in and getting people on board and getting people excited about the customer, the action of running a customer journey workshop is as valuable as the final deliverable. You know, I think it was Keith that said he liked the Machiavellian twist of including a senior stakeholder, and he's entirely right. That is as much it. It's about getting buy-in. So doing it remotely just doesn't really work. I'm really sorry. That's not the answer you wanted.
Are there any alternatives? So if you can't use customer journey mapping there, what would you do then?
Yeah, I mean, then I would fall back on, for me, I think you can get a lot of the value. If you think about the value of customer journey mapping, a lot of it is about understanding the customer and it's about having those conversations with the customer. So then I'd probably rely on things like user interviews, usability testing, all of which can be done remotely. And then what I do in order for that internal buy-in bit of it, I'll create like what I call horror videos of the kind of worst moments of where people are really struggling. And I send those around to colleagues to kind of show them how painful it can be.
It doesn't surprise me given the background or the background right here.
Perfect background for it, haven't I? Yeah.
A wonderful setting to set up your horror videos right there.
Keith, in answer to your question in the chat, sorry, it was Jared Spool. I'll pop it in. Carry on.
Yep. We have a question from Paul, not you, Paul, the other Paul Hanaoka. How do you change your approach in customer journeys for account-based marketing?
You don't change it at all. An account-based marketing, if I'm understanding his definition of account-based marketing, but from my perspective, that's about managing ongoing long-term relationships. But actually, if you remember back to the charity example I gave at the beginning of my talk, that was a long-term relationship that escalated slowly of a series of upsells, from a one-off donation to a monthly donation to fundraising to volunteering to, you know, leaving a legacy. So actually exactly the same process applies whether you're talking about account-based marketing or whatever approach. There is still a journey that the user is going on. Sometimes that journey can be a bit more cyclical, maybe with an account basing where you're going in loops of projects. So you create instead of having a linear customer journey mapping, you have a looped customer journey map. Makes no difference really.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right, that makes sense. We also have a question from Amin. Can we have a copy of the slides? And also, if you are in a company that has a low UX maturity, but emphasis is on marketing, how do we take the baby steps to bring in a user focus?
Yeah.
It's kind of similar to what I asked in the beginning, though.
Yeah. And to be honest, it's kind of, you know, it was what I was selling, you know, saying really through the whole thing. I think a lot of time it's, you know, don't aim for perfect out of the gate. That's the mistake everybody makes. You know, oh, well, you read all this best practice on sites like Smashing Magazine. You know, you need to do this. You know, Facebook send people off to Uganda to, you know, interview users. And you think that's what you've got to do. But there's no way you're gonna persuade anyone to do that. So little things are better. And that's why I start with just consolidating what you already know about the customer journey map. In terms of the slides, yeah, absolutely. I'll post a PDF while I'm being asked the next question.
Fantastic. Pavan is wondering, is journey mapping useful for the user interface interaction design? Yeah,
absolutely. Because it provides context. You know, when you're creating an interface design, you know, a lot of interface design is, well, let's say we're designing a mobile app, right? And you are the designer on a mobile app. Okay, so when are people using that mobile app in the journey? Right? Are they using it as a research tool, or are they using it as a purchasing tool, or is it a customer support tool, or is it all of those things? Right? You need to know that to design a good interface, don't you? You need to know what questions people have, what's front and center in their minds to inform your information architecture. You need to know what their tasks are, so that they can you can create the right visual hierarchy on the site. All of that information is contained in a customer journey map. So absolutely, it's incredible. It's not just a marketing tool. It is a tool that brings together all of the disciplines, whether you're an entrepreneur, a product owner, a marketer, a user interface person, a copywriter. All of these people can benefit from it.
Okay. By the way, just a quick note at this point, I just pushed the slides to the membership dashboard as well, so everybody should be able to get them in a moment. Alessandro is also asking, do you have any suggestions on what criteria to use in prioritizing audiences?
Yes, business value, right? That's the only one that ultimately matters, right? Now, how do you define business value? Well, you can define business value in multiple ways. There are different levels. So you can, I tend to look at a lifetime value of customers, because I think a lot of organizations tend to be very short-termist in their attitude. So they kind of look at, they're initially winning customers and stuff like that. I'm such a pro. It didn't even phase me, Vitaly. It's fine. The other thing that you can do, you also need to consider things like influencers as well, because they have business value. They might not be buyers, but they still have value to the organization in another way. But basically, it comes down to who spends the most money over their life cycle.
Okay. Oh, we have so many more questions coming.
That's it's good. We've got such an engaged audience. It's brilliant.
Yeah. We have a question from Paul, and that's again not Paul Boag. Any tips and strategies for getting access to customers when they're working inside of a large enterprise company?
Oh, it's shit, isn't it? It's a real pain in the ass, that particular one. And no, there is no magic answer. That's why often when I initially run customer journey mapping, if I'm honest, most of the time it's internal stakeholders that I run the initial workshop with. Then once I've got a draft of the customer journey, I will then I will do a remote call. Oftentimes the best way of getting people in large enterprise organizations, these are really busy people. So what you do is you let them schedule a remote interview over something like Zoom. I use Calendly as well, so that they can pick a time that's most appropriate to them. I often share the customer journey map in advance of that call, and then we just have a discussion about it. What matched your journey, what didn't match your journey, what things seem odd in here, those kinds of questions. And then that gets around the remote aspect, because you're not asking them to actually create anything. You're asking them to basically criticize something, because people find it much easier to respond to something that they can see than to create something from scratch.
Oh, no, I'm not muted. It's interesting for me also to see that very often this kind of artifacts like customer journey maps and so on, they seem to be, many people in the organization feel like this is totally unnecessary. This is just a visualization of the company, but then at the same time, we know our processes and we know how it works. So why would you want to visualize, spend so much time designing pixels to make sure that everything looks wonderful? And there is a very interesting question that kind of related to that by Chris, who asks, any one-liners to deliver against the pushback, like you're making things too complicated, you make too much effort out of this, you're bringing too many considerations into the fold. This usually comes from a more senior level stakeholder.
Okay, then I say, yeah, absolutely no problem. Can you sketch up the customer journey for me as you see it, Mr. Senior Stakeholder, and I'll pass it via some users and see if it's, if it's actually fits reality. And then I just do exactly the same calls as I did before. And of course it'll be miles off and it'll be wrong and it'll demonstrate the problem. I never argue with people. I never tell people that they're wrong or they're ignorant I just say, oh, great, brilliant. We can shortcut the process and go straight to validation then, right? And you bypass it all, but it still obviously proves the point.
So you kind of try to bring it things into perspective and get to the results despite the whatever is coming your way.
Yeah, all you're doing is changing the order a little bit, because what will happen is they'll do their made up bullshit. You'll do the validation, which will prove them wrong. Then you can run the customer journey mapping after that. And that's kind of fine. That's all right. You know, whatever works. But no, you can't tell a senior manager that he's wrong. And to be fair, I think you're going to have to be careful when you get the results back from that, right, that prove him wrong. So go back to him and show him that and say, it looks like things. Don't say he's wrong, because if you say he's wrong, you're just going to piss him off. Say, it looks like the market might have moved, or that things may have changed. Okay. And you do it with him one-on-one, because if you do it in a group and you show him up in a group, he's going to dig his heels in and he's going to say, oh, well, your research was wrong or whatever. Right. Because he's going to feel threatened. So do it with him individually. Don't say that he's wrong. Just say that things have moved on, and perhaps we ought to do a new mapping workshop at this point.
Right. Okay. Also, Chris is saying that he also pasted the link on facilitating remote design sprints, which he thinks it might be useful for you as well. Okay. Another thing. So Matt is also asking here, dealing with a marketing team that thinks that they're UX specialists and treat personas with empathy maps and journey maps as interchangeable.
Sure.
How would you approach them to collaborate with members of other teams on a journey map workshop?
I would butter up their ego, right? If people think they're a UX expert, tell them they're a UX expert. I really don't care, right? So you say, we're struggling. We need to understand the journey better, right? Your personas and your empathy maps and all the stuff, things that you've created have been brilliant, but we're trying to put them in a broader context of the entire customer journey. Please come along. We would really like your involvement, because your expertise and knowledge will be invaluable, right? So don't try and correct people. Don't try and tell them they're wrong. Play into them. If they think they're experts and they know this stuff, then get them in. We need your expertise. You can prove them wrong in the room.
Okay. Well, as we keep going, we have more and more questions coming in.
I'm loving it. I never get bored of answering people's questions with my own made up bullshit.
Well, I think you have some experience to share at this point. So maybe you could also share a little bit about the tools that you like. So you mentioned Calendly. Actually, I've been using Calendly as well, just to make it easier to set up appointments and meetings and block out things and so on. Maybe on any other tools that you can recommend. Maybe you can even use screen sharing to show them.
Yeah. Well, because there's so many questions, I don't want to kind of waste time just on one person's question too much. But as it so happens, I have written an article on this subject.
Oh my, of course you did.
Of course I have. 14 years worth of articles. I've written one on everything. But actually, this one was only a couple of weeks ago. So it's entitled The Best UX Design Tools You Need for Testing. And it's got tools for usability testing, testing visuals, eye tracking testing, eye tracking prediction software. It's got qualitative usability testing, quantitative usability testing, card sorting, you name it, it's all in there.
Okay, so that's very useful.
Keith, I am shameless, but someone asked me the question, right? That wasn't me volunteering it. It was a question I was asked.
I'm not going to comment on that at all. But in general, I feel like in many ways, when we kind of deal with customer journey maps and things like that, I think there are many situations where almost every single person I know will end up with. Like one of them is having to sell UX. The other one would be marketing war against UX, war, this kind of thing. Are there any other things? And this is what Ivan is asking. Any other things that kind of show up quite a lot, and how would you, like, really common pain points, and how do you argue with them? How do you resolve them?
It's a good question. I think there's often a lot of debate and argument about prioritization because we've got very limited resources as organizations, and you get a lot of vanity projects, people coming to you with we want to build this, or, my nephew says we need a Facebook app or whatever. So you can have a lot of stuff, problems around that. The way that I deal with that is have a very a policy, right? It sounds so dull, doesn't it? Web governance we're talking about now. Contain your excitement, people. But actually, it's very useful because if you've got a policy that this is how we assess incoming projects, all projects are assessed on the same basis. They all are assessed in the same way. Then it stops, the most senior person coming in and jumping the line, or somebody who's got an urgent project that needs to be done tomorrow. I am sorry, Keith, I'm going to do it again. I've just posted another article in the chat, which is a system that I use quite a lot called digital triage, which is the methodology that I use for prioritizing incoming projects. And actually it helps overcome a lot of these conflict points about whose project gets done first. So that's a big one. What other common ones are there?
Oh, maybe that's a good stuff for an article that you could write at some point soon, because you like writing apparently.
Yeah, there you go. I'll write an article on that. It's a good
Fantastic.
one. I mean, there's a lot of disagreements between developers and designers, I guess. That's another common area of conflict. But I've written on that as well, I think.
Of course you did, but maybe you can share a few things, like if you have because it's a very common thing. So if you have a disagreement, how would you resolve that?
Yeah. So, I mean, disagreements really always come down to just understanding the other person's point of view. So Keith's saying he can't see the links I'm posting. Is there a reason for that? Oh, it's because I'm posting them to panelists, not attendees.
No. This is how you roll, Paul.
Is it? Have I got
always
this wrong?
Very professional, attentive.
Well, I don't know. I've never used this system before. This is yours. Now, how do I send something to attendees then? See, you
need to select. There is a dot thing.
There's a really obvious button just there. Right. Okay.
Yes.
Here we go. Here we go. Here's a list of all of the things that I should have sent to everybody that I didn't. There's the digital triage one. How about that? That keep everybody happy now? Just advertising to Vitaly. That's a very good point. I'm wasting my time with him. He's so tight. Right. What were we talking about? Oh, yeah. A lot of it.
Developers, designers.
Comes back to what we were saying earlier, doesn't it? Right. With disagreements, it comes back to applying the principles that we know as user experience designers and people, and actually using those and applying those to the people we're talking to. So, what do they care about? What motivates them? What's their goal? What's their pain point? What are their questions? What are their concerns? And playing into those, talking their language, meeting them where they are, rather than pushing our own agenda the whole time.
Mm-hmm. The final question from Mr. Andy Clark here. Do you have a collection of map examples, and are they shared anywhere?
What's he talking about? A customer journey map.
Paul, yeah, it's been a long day, yeah.
Oh dear. Yes, well, kind of. I have a few which are in the article that I mentioned in the slides. I'm now going to put that into the bless his heart. Yeah, who's that wrote that? David Taylor. You're now on my blacklist, you rude man. So yeah, I've just popped a link into the article on customer journey mapping, which has a few examples in there. He's right, Andy's right. I should really have a more comprehensive list than that. I will have to do that at some point.
Maybe then just one more thing I wanted to bring up as well. Namely, if you actually look back now, Paul, on your career and everything, all the companies and everything you worked on and so on and so forth, are there any lessons you would give to somebody who maybe is just coming to the industry? For example, the reason why I'm bringing this up now is because I was teaching in Netherlands and also in Portugal this year, and to UX designers and front-end developers who just coming, like fresh students, like coming and kind of trying to make sense of this industry and what it's like and so on. And especially front-end developers are extremely terrified with the state of things and all these acronyms and tooling and all of that that's coming. That's very frustrating to them as well. The UX designers feel like they are lost. They don't know what to start with, what tools to use, how does transition from design to development look like, what methodology to use. There are like literally hundreds of them, tons of articles like the one that you wrote with all the different things and tools and techniques and technologies and all that to use. So what would you recommend to people who are just kind of getting into all of this mess?
Oh, give up unless us old hands do it all. No.
That's a wrong answer. Let's just
No,
cut
I
it.
know it is, but it would. Well, it isn't. From my business point of view, it'd be more work for me, wouldn't there, if they all gave up? No.
He's not that mean usually, I promise.
In all seriousness, it is hard, and if it makes you feel any better, it doesn't matter how long you've worked in this industry, it's always overwhelming, right? And that is our world. We work in a world where things move fast and they change. I think my advice is don't become overly attached to anything, right? Don't become overly attached to a specific tool or a specific methodology, because they come and go. For years, many people were very much attached to Flash and thought that was the future of the internet. I remember, me learning Cold Fusion. That was a waste of my time. These things come and they go. And even with best practice evolves and changes as the web changes and user behavior changes. So to some degree, that makes you feel more overwhelmed because it's going to change. But on another hand, it's very freeing as well, because it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter what tool you use. It doesn't matter what platform you're working on, because it'll go away eventually and you'll have to do another one, right? So there is no right answer. It's that feeling, it's the realization that there isn't one way to do things, right? There isn't one best way of doing things. And that's the trouble with people like me and Vitaly and these conferences that he arranges. You're as a speaker, you're expected to go on the stage and say, this is the way you should do things. But actually, that's not true. This is the way that I've done things, right? That list of UX design tools I've just shared are the ones I like the most. They're not necessarily the best. They're just the ones I use, right? And so, yeah, just chill out, really. Don't worry too much about it. And stay curious. Want to use those, look at using those, learning those new things, playing around with it, play with all of these things, but don't get hung up if you can't look at them all. That's not the end of the world. The one thing I would put more focus on, than learning new platforms or new tools, learning those soft skills, right? Those are the ones that really benefit you and don't change, right? So learning how to communicate, to work as a part of a team, to sell your services, to present a case, to all of those kinds of soft skills. If you want to run your own business, how to deal with your finances and time management.
Accounting is so important.
Yeah, all of that kind of stuff. Knowing those are the kinds of things that actually don't change. So they're almost more worthwhile in some ways, getting a bit more serious about those than it is the other stuff. But yeah, just relax and enjoy the ride.
That sounds like a good ending for a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, Paul, for being with us today. A quick note from my side. I just pushed the update with the link to the video and also to the slides live. So when you, dear members, if you sign into your membership, you will be able to find them right there. As of what's coming up next, we have a webinar with Cassie Evans coming up next Tuesday, actually. Where she's going to run a webinar on interactive web animation with SVG. And that's super exciting. I'm looking forward to her insights. And she's going to do some animation live. And then after that, a week later, we have a webinar with Andy Clark about art direction and layouts and stuff. So don't miss that one either.
They can't all be good ones.
Well,
that's the shame.
Try our best.
Fill it that week, really.
Paul.
Well, that's only because I know Andy's in here that I feel like I can be rude to him. I wouldn't do it behind his back. I'd quite happily.
Yeah, of course you wouldn't. Of course you wouldn't. All right. So with this in mind, thanks everyone for joining. Thank you, Paul, for joining as well. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening, day, morning, night, whatever. I don't know, because we have people from all over the world. Please also write a few things on Slack so we can actually connect a little bit better. If you have any questions for Paul later, I'm sure he'll be happy to answer them there as well. And, I'm looking forward to the next time. Thanks, everyone, and see you soon. Bye.